For our first lecture, we will begin at the beginning, at least where I see the beginning, which is in Kathy Caruth's close reading of Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory of the unconscious mind. For me, trauma theory is a way of understanding literature, film, culture, and history, and it begins at Yale University, where Caruth and her cohort began to take and have conversations with Holocaust historians, deconstructive literary critics, and romanticists, and psychoanalysts to articulate a new way to understand Sigmund Freud's discovery not only of the unconscious, but the related concepts of traumatic neurosis and the death drive, which far exceed or go beyond the original foundation or formulation of the pleasure principle. As Caruth tells us in the introduction to Explorations in Memory, the field has deep connections and relevance with sociology, history, film and literary studies, psychology, and even medicine and the law. What I hope to do in the next hour is to think about the genesis of trauma as an important theoretical lens, starting with Caruth's reading of Freud's Beyond the Pleasure Principle from 1920, and then going even farther back to a reading of Freud's interpretation of dreams. So much happens in those 20 years regarding Freud's dream analysis. Whereas Freud begins his career by understanding dream work as a fulfillment of wishes, in 1920 he must pivot and offer corrections to that earlier theory after seeing survivors from World War I who are having dreams. But these dreams are not so straightforwardly fulfilling a wish, unless we conceive of it as a wish to return to a traumatic scene or a missed encounter with death or loss, an encounter not at all prepared for, thus leading to a repetition compulsion. In this journey back in time, we will consider such key terms as witness, PTSD, and ethics, with a focus on Freud's representation, once again, of the vulnerable child, a figure he returns to time and again as inextricable from the language of war that pervades so much of the thinking on trauma, from World War I to World War II to the Vietnam War, and certainly beyond to the present day, where war is ongoing. One could argue that traumatic theory is born on the opening pages of Caruth's Unclaimed Experience, where she closely reads Freud's analysis of Tasso's epic about Tancred and Clorinda in Freud's Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Here she cites Freud's overview of this story. This is lecture 1. I should have started there. Trauma as a discipline. Here is Kathy Caruth observing Freud's paraphrase of this Tasso epic. Its hero, Tancred, unwittingly kills his beloved Clorinda in a duel while she is disguised in the armor of an enemy knight. After her burial, he makes his way into a strange magic forest, which strikes the Crusaders' army with terror. He slashes with his sword at a tall tree, but blood streams from the cut, and the voice of Clorinda, whose soul is imprisoned in the tree, is heard complaining that he has wounded his beloved once again. Caruth recalls that this was interesting to Freud because of the idea of the unwitting repetition of killing Clorinda twice. This traumatic repetition, Freud will tell us, and Caruth after him, is what defines traumatic experience. For Caruth, quote, as Tasso's story dramatized it, the repetition at the heart of catastrophe, the experience that Freud will call traumatic neurosis, emerges as the unwitting reenactment of an event that one cannot simply leave behind. And yet for Carruth, Freud fails to see something else. The significance in this tale of the voice of Clorinda, who cries out, demanding to be heard. Carruth continues, what seems to me particularly striking in the example of Tasso is not just the unconscious act of the inflection of the injury and its inadvertent and unwished for repetition, but the moving and sorrowful voice that cries out, a voice that is paradoxically released through the wound. So Freud tells this story to emphasize the repetition part. And Carruth returns to that story to say, listen to the voice of Clorinda. And that will become the heart of modern trauma studies. In this moment that we get such key ideas as an address and bear witness, not to mention enigma, which helps us to see the commitment to non-mastery at the heart of this theoretical discourse. This is Carruth. The voice of his beloved addresses him, and in this address bears witness for the past he has unwittingly repeated. Tancred's story thus represents traumatic experience, not only as the enigma of a human agent's repeated and unknowing acts, but also the enigma of the otherness of a human voice that cries out from a wound, a voice that witnesses a truth that Tancred himself cannot fully know. So Carruth adds this idea of the otherness of the human voice. What I want to add today to this exchange between Tasso and Freud, and later to Carruth, is the language of war in this story. This story that is also a love story and a woman's story. Via the significance of the haunting voice that cries out, I would also like to look even farther back than beyond the pleasure principle to Freud's interpretation of dreams, where even so early on, Freud bumps up against a dream he cannot fully understand, which calls into question everything he has argued to that point. In awakening Lucinda once again today, I want to reassess her significance in the 21st century that unfortunately has a new and ever-growing array of traumatic events to unpack. Carruth traces the etymological origins of the word trauma to wound. As she argues, the term trauma is understood as a wound inflicted not upon the body, but upon the mind. But what seems to be suggested by Freud and beyond the pleasure principle is that the wound of the mind, the breach in the mind's experience of time, self, and the world, is not unlike the wound of the body, a simple and healable event, but rather an event like Tancred's first infliction of a moral wound on the disguised Clorinda in the duel is experienced too soon, unexpectedly to be fully known, and is therefore not available to consciousness until it imposes itself yet again, repeatedly, in the nightmares and repetition actions of the survivor. And that's one of the things we'll be working out today. If Freud says in Interpretation of Dreams that all dreams are fulfillments of wishes, then in 1920, when he's seeing survivors of World War I, survivors who are having dreams but are traumatic dreams, he has to wonder if his theory is correct. How could those repeated trauma dreams be, in fact, fulfillments of wishes? And here we have another important aspect of trauma studies, which is an indication of the structure of the event itself. It is an event that is experienced too soon. As a result, it is not available to consciousness until it appears in nightmares and repetitive actions of survivors. For me, the key here is survive. As trauma studies repeatedly emphasizes, the crisis in subjectivity is not simply to confront death, but to come away from that confrontation only to survive, to have to live to tell the story, which paradoxically is not easily accessible to memory, much less language itself. What is significant is that Freud understood how well the psyche worked in 1920, 20 years after the Dream Book, where he begins to see that it is not so simple to say all dreams are fulfillments of wishes. He is starting to wonder why his patients are acting like they have actual head injuries. And this is why I gave you that very dry, technical 3 pages from Beyond the Pleasure Principle from book 2. He says, a condition has long been known and described, which occurs after severe mechanical concussions, railway disasters, and other accidents involving a risk of life. It has been given the name traumatic neurosis. The terrible war, he's talking about World War I, which has just ended, gave rise to a great number of illnesses of this kind. But it at least put an end to the temptation to attribute the cause of the disorder to organic lesions of the nervous system brought about by mechanical force. So he's asking, why are people acting like they've had blunt force wounds to the head? For Freud, the traumatic repetitions and nightmares cannot be explained by mechanical concussions, organic lesions, injury, connection with the skull or the head or the brain in any way. Instead, the problem seems to come from the inside, as the psyche seems to be working against itself by returning the survivor to the scene of trauma repeatedly. Freud will go on to underline this point. In the case of war neuroses, the fact that the same symptoms sometimes come about without the intervention of any gross mechanical force seemed at once enlightening and bewildering. Imagine being Freud in 1920 saying, why are these people acting injured? Now, dreams occurring in traumatic neurosis have the characteristic of repeatedly bringing the patient back into the situation of the accident, a situation from which he wakes up in yet another fright. This astonishes people far too little. I love that little note that Freud saying, why are people not astonished by this? As we will discuss later today, Freud is interested not only in the situation of war, but also accidents, newly worrisome in the technological age. You can begin to see that this troubling case of war neurosis has Freud questioning the previous decades of his work on dreams, saying, quote, anyone who accepts it as something self-evident that their dreams should put them back at night into the situation that caused them to fall ill has misunderstood the nature of dreams. And here he seems quite innocent, right? Isn't the psyche, isn't the internal mind supposed to be there to help us, to protect us, to know things? In fact, he would say yes to the second part. The psyche is trying to protect us, but that is why it closes off that knowledge of the event that one has survived that is impossible to register. Why would the psyche put the survivor back into a traumatic nightmare? Well, this is a very compelling question, I would like to argue that this kind of repetition can be seen historically and culturally as well. How can we understand the ways that history seems to repeat? The cultural artifacts seem to dwell on certain images as if possessed by them. The last point puts the focus on how to represent traumatic events and unspeakable illness, an issue we will spend time talking about via literary representations and the language of film. I know there's some narrative medicine and medical humanities people in the room too, and I promise this is related. If a survivor does not have access to this history, then how can it be transmitted for a culture at large? As Carruth will go on to say, this is a paradox at the heart of humanity, the radical need of the ethical witness to tell a story nearly impossible to speak. What is so interesting for Carruth and others is that in this section, Book 2 of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud suddenly shifts from a discussion of traumatic neuroses to child's play, saying, "At this point, I propose to leave the dark and dismal subject of the traumatic neurosis and pass on to examine the method of working employed by the mental apparatus in one of its earliest normal activities. I mean, in child's play." So in Book 2, he goes from a description of traumatic nightmares and then says, let's shift now to talk about child's play. And that is very interesting for trauma theorists. For Freud, the child's play described after watching his grandson, which we learn in a footnote, play as a way of coping with his mother's departure, tells another kind of story. Freud describes this boy as throwing toys away and from saying, oh, 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 which he interprets very liberally, I would say, as fort in German or gone in English. This is seen in the game of the wooden reel with a piece of string. When the boy throws the reel, it disappears. He says, oh, meaning, for Freud, gone. And when he pulls the reel back by the string, the boy gives a joyful da. There. Freud sums it up by saying, this then was the complete dream. Game, sorry, not dream. That's the point. This was the game. Disappearance and return. Going on to articulate that, quote, it is clear that in their play, children repeat everything that has been made a great impression on them in real life, and that in doing so, they make themselves master of a situation. It is this mastery, and also preparation for loss, that leads Freud to say that this is a normal activity as opposed to the neurosis of a survivor. For Freud, the normal activity seems to be a way of coping, of preparing for something unpleasant like his mother's departure, and recalling via the toy that even though something or someone goes away, she, the spool, the mother, will come back. This child being observed is Freud's grandson, whose own mother died when he was under 6. It is this very same grandson who also threw his toy to the floor when learning that his father was going to war, with the words, go to the front. And it's so adorable, isn't it, that Freud spells front with the W sound that his grandson would say, front. It is easy to read this as a grandfather reflection on a complex family dynamic. But one of the things we might be able to see via this juxtaposition is that in quote-unquote unhealthy situations of traumatic neurosis, there is no preparation for a sudden departure or loss, which results in the unconscious consistently looping back for that unclaimed experience or missed encounter. Again, Tancred, in his Warrior's Armid, stabs Clorinda twice. This, for Freud, would explain the traumatic nightmare and Tancred's unwitting killing of Clorinda once again. Coupled with the lack of preparation for the event, the repetition and observation of psychic effects, when there is no physical impact for the head or brain, I would say this is the beginning of an understanding of trauma. one that Carruth articulated in the 1990s when looking back via the Diagnostic Statistician's Manual of 1980, where PTSD, 60 years later, was finally added as a diagnosable ailment. We'll talk about this in discussion. I'm really interested in the fact that PTSD is not added to the manual until 1980, and this is because psychiatrists were seeing victims or survivors from another war, and that is the Vietnam War. And one of the things I might ask is, why does it take 60 years for PTSD to be added to a statistician's manual to offer as a diagnosis for these kinds of symptoms? In Explorations in Memory, Carruth offers a definition of trauma that is perhaps less literary. There is no discussion of Clorinda here, and it is more scientific. She takes up the symptoms of repeated hallucinations, dreams, and behaviors, and goes on to clarify that an event, while traumatic for one person, may not be so for another. What leads to the traumatic response is the structure of the event or experience, as it is not fully assimilated at the time, only belatedly, as if the survivor is in a repeated possession of the event itself. For Carruth, the history of trauma can, quote, only take place through the listening of another, an ethical witness who can help process the event. These ideas of the impossible, though essential witness, and the language of history can be seen in the Holocaust writing of Shoshana Fellman and Dory Lobb in Testimony. And our professor, Shipra Atolia, quoted from Elie Wiesel's Night. That's another example of an interest in how studying the Holocaust leads to a greater understanding of trauma. And Fellman and Lobb's testimony, Crises of Witnessing, in Literature, Psychoanalysis, and History, we can kind of see a development of the theory, but again, it picks up on a discourse from the 1899 to 1900 book, where that Freud was writing about trauma's relationship with dreams. I'm going to make sure I didn't miss any slides for you. All right, here is the slide from Freud talking about the child's play from Beyond the Pleasure Principle, when he says, at this point, I propose to leave the dark and dismal subject of trauma to talk about child's play. And we can return again to this in discussion. I'm curious about what you say about this moment. And now we're going to move back another 20 years to 1900, where Freud is talking about dreams very early on. It's important to think about the fact that Interpretation of Dreams was published on the brink of a new century. It articulated for the first time Sigmund Freud's theory that all dreams are fulfillments of wishes, and that the primary purpose of dreams is to allow the dreamer to continue sleeping. Trauma theorists think that Freud invented the unconscious. That is something we deeply believe in. When I teach this to students, 21st century students, they're suspicious even of this. They wonder if the unconscious is in fact real. So we can maybe discuss this, but my remarks take for granted the fact that there is an unconscious. And it was Freud and his colleagues around the 1895, 1900s that have kind of figured this out. In this groundbreaking work, Freud details many convincing case studies to establish his new theory, until, curiously, he introduces the elusive dream of the burning child. Another child, right? Another dream. A dream, in fact, that seems to disprove his theory because it is so transparent. Unlike the other dreams Freud discusses in his dream book, the dream of the burning child carries with it no hidden meaning, indicating Freud's own blind spot in his theory of dream interpretation. So he gets to a patient in 1899 who tells about this very graphic dream, and Freud is thinking, there's nothing to interpret here. It's all very straightforward. And what does this mean about an idea of dream interpretation, in fact, of psychoanalysis. You don't need a psychoanalyst to talk about this dream, right? Whereas Freud's original theory suggests that dreams allow sleepers to continue sleeping and unconsciously to fulfill wishes, Jacques Lacan returns to the dream of the child burning in order to introduce an idea of trauma not imagined in 1900. I wonder if I skipped some pages. Okay. According to Lacan, who had a new perspective on burning 20 years after the Nazi Holocaust, the trauma of facing a burning child in a dream actually fails both to allow the dreamer to fulfill a wish and to continue sleeping. After all, Lacan emphasizes, the fright of the voice of the child comes from a dream. It wakes the dreamer into another reality and then calls for a witness to the burning. As such, for both Lacan and Freud before him, the dream of the burning child fuses sleeping with waking, ultimately appearing as allegories for a failure to wake, the failure to sleep, and implicitly the failure to awaken to a child burning. So again, with another paradox, I'm going to use this dream of the burning child to emphasize not successes in understanding, but failures at every turn. And that's something that trauma studies is interested in also. How do repeated failures actually succeed in telling us something important that has not been fully processed? Freud's dream theory originated in his discovery that dreams have a hidden meaning, a meaning that needs to be interpreted in order to grasp how it fulfills a certain wish. In other words, Freud emphasized in his new psychoanalytic theory how interpreting dreams reveals peculiar wishes unattainable in waking life. However, Freud's reading of the dream of the burning child incorporates his discussion neither of interpretation nor of unconscious wishes. For Freud, this special dream does not prove a theory about wish fulfillment. This dream proves several failures inextricable from the dream. A father's failure to awaken to the sound of a child's voice, Freud's corresponding failure to read the dream, and the dual failure of two fathers, the father of the child and the father of psychoanalysis, to address the burning child. In this unique dream, then, Freud emphasizes darkness, where he expects only to see light. I don't know if you experience this yourselves. You're writing a research paper and you think all of the evidence that you give will prove your point. And then you run into something that disproves your entire thesis. And then you think, now what am I going to do? Do I forget that I saw that? Do I add it to my research? What Freud does is add it to his research and acts as if everything is okay until the very end when he says, I have failed at everything, which I feel like so, I don't know, grateful for, actually. So introducing this darkness revealed, Freud describes how a child appears in the dream of a grieving father, a father who drifts off to sleep after days and nights of watching over his sick child. This child, Freud suggests, eventually dies without a witness. In the next room, as the father sleeps, the child's body lies surrounded by candles under the watch of an old man who has already proven his incompetence as a watchman. And then here's the discussion, and you have a slide for that. After a few hours, Freud recalls, the father dreams that the child is standing by his bedside, grasps him by the arm, and whispers to him reproachfully, Father, can't you see that I am burning? This also goes back to the opening remarks about Manchester by the Sea, right? So many of these literary, philosophical, cinematic representations of trauma have to do with somebody missing the scene of a child's burning. He wakes up, notices a bright light coming from the room where the body is lying, hurries over, and finds the old attendant falling asleep. the shroud and an arm of the beloved body burnt by a lighted candle that had fallen across it. So to be clear here, the boy had already died, and he's wrapped in a shroud, and the watchman was supposed to make sure that everything was okay for this mourning process, and the candle falls over and burns the child. As Christopher Finks has suggested, this dream and these words within it have dual origins. The address of the child that originates from within the dream carries as much weight as the father's pursuit of the child in his sleep, establishing via the figure of the father the ethical pursuit to witness the event. Father, wake up! Can't you see that I am burning? For Finks, there is a pressing need to act in relation to the terrible accident that has fallen the child's corpse. The dreamer appears to know at some level he is sensing that he needs to act. The need to act, in other words, appears to contradict the purpose of the dream, which is, for Freud, all of those hundreds of pages before then, to continue dreaming. This unforeseen contradiction, in fact, reinforces Freud's remarkable failure at interpretation. Carruth concludes that, quote, the passing on of the child's words transmits simply not a reality that can be grasped in these words' representation, but the ethical imperative of an awakening that has yet to occur. We'll talk a lot about trauma with regard to an event, witnessing the event. But a rereading of Carruth, especially now in the 21st century, reveals all of the times that she emphasizes the need to bear witness to an event. It goes all the way back to Freud in 1900, right? The ethical imperative of an awakening that has yet to occur. That can be for the Freud dream discussion and the father who needs to wake up. That can be for all of us who need to wake up in the 21st century. In fact, Freud himself acknowledged that among the dreams I have learned through others, there is one that now has very special claims on our attention. Here Freud calls the source of this difficulty a dream. However, the dream appears as more like a nightmare, although Freud refuses to describe it as such. The dream, in other words, possesses nightmarish qualities not yet named in Freud, but which nevertheless become the place where tradition and traumatic history emerge via the one sentence of the burning child. After proving a simple and clear interpretation of the dream of the father, a father who dreams after a few hours of sleep that the child is standing at his bedside, grasps him by the arm, and whispers reproachfully, Freud suggests. We will notice then, this is all Freud, that this dream too is not without a wish fulfillment. In the dream, the dead child behaves as if he were alive. He warns his father himself. He comes up to his bed and tugs him by the arm, just as he probably did in that memory from which the dream first took the bit of what the child said. We could imagine that the child, when he was alive, said, Father, Dad, can't you see? Now, as it was for the sake of this wish fulfillment that the father prolonged his sleep for a moment, he gave the dream a prior claim over his waking reflection because it was able to show him the child alive again. On a first reading, this interpretation appears like all the other dreams recounted in Interpretation of Dreams, an uncanny image or event in a dream that draws on recent memory traces and reveals a wish of a dreamer. For the father, the wish was to see his child alive again, even if it means seeing that speaking child on fire in his dream while sleeping through the child's actual burning. For Freud, however, this dream marks the failure of his theory and is not exemplary at all, as Lacan would have it. Here, Freud explains. And this is where he confesses to all of us that what he is working out is not actually working as he expected. And again, I would say that we kind of talk about interpretation of dreams as that famous dream book. But what I want to do, like 120 years after, is go back to that and say, Actually, this is where he's figuring out a theory of trauma, and we maybe didn't see it there at first. So this is Freud. So far, we have mainly been concerned with probing after the hidden meaning of dreams, the route we should take to discover it, and the means the dream work has employed to hide it. And now we come upon this dream, which offers no problems of interpretation, whose meaning is given undisguised, and we note that it still retains the essential characteristic that distinguish a dream sharply from our waking thought and rouse our need for explanation. Only when we have got rid of everything that has to do with the work of interpretation can we see how incomplete our psychology of dreams still is. When he says we and our, he means I and my. He says, I've been talking about the importance of interpreting symbols, but this needs no interpretation. What are we doing here, right? And emphasizing not his success as a theorist, but rather his failure to create a complete psychology, Freud worries that no meaning is hidden in this paradoxically difficult dream. If this is the case, Freud wonders, what separates a waking dream or daydream from the dreams in sleep that are supposed to reveal the unconscious? What is the point of a psychoanalyst like Freud? Through this troubling image of the burning child, Freud comes upon a dream in which meaning is undisguised, and yet it still has the essential characteristics separating dream from waking thoughts, and therefore needs to be explained. It is precisely these lingering, essential, but unnamed characteristics that reveal to Freud his incomplete psychology. What are the characteristics of this dream that distinguish it from waking if it has no latent content? Freud seems unable to answer this question during such a critical moment in his argument, making his exemplary dream, in fact, a failure. Or put somewhat more precisely, this exemplary dream, itself a success, points up the failure of Freud's entire theory. I would propose that this very dream underscores for Freud the problem of reading a dream, linking inextricably in this moment both the father's failure to wake up and Freud's failure to interpret. Freud's failure to interpret the dream reinforces his own failure to address the child, disclosing how the problem of address and interpretation are inextricable in this dream sequence. And again, that is what we do, right? As humans, as literary scholars, we interpret, we try to interpret. We also answer the address of literary works, film works, and the address of one another, right? Given the status of interpretation, what are these essential characteristics to which Freud refers, separating the dream from waking fantasies? Although Freud did not have an answer at the time, we might say that the answer resides in the dying child, silenced in the dream, the child speaking inaudibly outside of the dream, while also heard undeniably on the inside. Until this very realization, Freud had been remarkably successful in proving his new theory. Until now, he says. Until now, if I'm not much mistaken, all the paths we have trodden had led us into the light, to enlightenment, and to full understanding. From the moment we propose to go more deeply into the psyche's inner processes of dreaming, all our ways lead into the dark. It is impossible for us, this is still Freud, to get as far as explaining the dream as a psychical process, for explaining means tracing back to what is already known. And at present, the psychological knowledge does not exist that we could use as an explanatory framework for what we have been able to deduce from our psychological scrutiny of dreams. This is basically a long way of saying I do not know. On the contrary, we shall be obliged to put forward a set of new assumptions, touching speculatively on the structure of the psychical apparatus and the play of forces active in it. though we must take care not to spin them out too far beyond the first logical links, for if we do, their worth will vanish into uncertainty. The new knowledge at the heart of this plea of the dream's burning child, the unheard and heard voice of the child, suggests for the first time that aspects of dreams and the psychical process are, in fact, unknowable. We have until 12:30. Is that true? I wanted to give us time to reflect on some of these things and on some of these passages. So maybe I'll just present for 5 or 10 minutes longer, and then we can come together and think about these passages and what's at stake before our time ends at 12:30. So I'll leave the world of Freud for a second. And I want to jump forward to Jacques Lacan. And I'm not sure, I should even not take for granted that people are still talking about Freud in English departments. In my university, there are a lot of psychology students who say Freud has been discounted decades ago. And even now, like when I was a grad student in the 1990s, we all read Jacques Lacan's reading of Freud and thought it was all very cool. And now I'm not sure that that is even the case. People might have thrown Lacan out with Freud to say Lacan is like so impenetrable. What are we even doing, right? So I just want to put Jacques Lacan back on the table for a second, and then we can kind of talk about the relevance of this thinking also. But keep in mind these, again, in the historical moment, Jacques Lacan was very worried about representation after the Holocaust. What could language and theory do to articulate what had happened with the Nazi genocide? So while Freud likely sought to enlighten his readers through a stirring new theory of dreams, Lacan reads Freud's dream of the burning child as a literal enlightening. In fact, Lacan draws upon Freud's imagery of light in order to advance a theory inextricable from burning flames in history. He is wondering, right, why are people not saying more about the fact that literal babies are being incinerated, which we heard about in Chipra's lovely reading of Night, right? Lacan is saying, go back to Freud's dream of the child saying, can't you see I'm burning? And do something about the actual history in front of us. In attending to these flames, Lacan's engagement with Freud suggests just how much is at stake in witnessing when an encounter with trauma prevents a necessary awakening. Lacan reverses Freud's interpretation of the dream of the burning child from a failure to awaken to a failure to sleep, and he suggests ultimately that the reality in the dream awakens the dreamer only to see another child burning. Inflected as it was through images of millions of children burning in concentration camps during World War II, the children not of dreams but of history, the child's voice in the dark is asking, can't you see I'm burning? And it takes on significantly more weight here than in the 1899, ultimately echoing the voices of millions of children in the early 1940s seeking a witness. In these echoes, Lacan found not voices of dead children, but voices of the murdered, emphasizing both what is at stake in the problem of a witness, as well as the profound difficulty of awakening to these voices. Lacan describes the child's one sentence within the dream, Father, can't you see I'm burning, as a torch or a firebrand. And it is not in the fire inside the dream that torches, bringing fire where it falls, but rather the words of the child. The sentence is a firebrand precisely because it uses the linguistic register of poetry to evoke the response of a witness. An act of homage, the dream of the burning child traces in the past the guilt of the future. This is another tricky thing about Lacan, right? He's like, how is this uncanny dream from 1899 with a burning child saying, can't you see I'm burning? How does that seem to anticipate or foretell or predict a history that people had yet to awaken to in the 1950s and 60s. The ethical relationship that this dream stages, in other words, necessitates not that we fully know what is being witnessed, but rather we acknowledge the address despite our inability fully to witness it. The paradox again, you will not fully grasp it, you must fully pay attention. This is the concept at the heart of trauma theory. The one idea that remains consistent into the 1920s when Freud is working out the effects of war and train accidents on the unconscious mind. It is also the paradox at the heart of human relationships, says Carruth, the idea that we are linked by traumas that we do not fully understand. So what I hope you remember from these opening remarks are the visuals, the literary examples. Tancred and Clorinda. Clorinda waking up a second time and saying with her voice, pay attention. The child in Beyond the Pleasure Principle who plays with that spool there and gone and there to compensate for the fact that there are things in life that we cannot prepare for. And then Freud's comments on the dream of the burning child and how that child also reinforces his failure as a father, as the father of psychoanalysis. So in these very theoretical concepts, I think we have some really kind of interesting literary moments to deal with. So if we had to reflect on what some of those passages said, and what again, this is interpretation on my own, right? Like what I am saying about what Carruth is saying about Freud. I'm wondering how we can talk about what's at stake, right? So what is the significance of a theoretical method grounded in not knowing, in non-mastery? Isn't that why we're all here in university? Isn't this why we read theory and literature and film so we can master it? And now we've turned to a theoretical discourse that says at the heart of it, you will not know everything. You cannot master. Number two is, what does Freud gain by using the figure of the child as illustrative of his theory of trauma? He's dealing with adults, right? He's looking at women with hysteria, he calls it. He's looking at survivors of train accidents, and he's looking at World War I veterans. But time and again, he goes back to represent a child, which could be interesting for us, right? And then the third is, what is the status of the ethical witness in trauma studies? I would say very important, but we can unpack that a little bit and you might want to push back, right? I had you read Bessel van der Kolk for today if there was time. Bessel van der Kolk says, doesn't matter, we can talk to each other all we want, we can listen to each other. It is the need for the body to relearn how to be a body that is important in curing trauma. So that's like the MD perspective. What does it mean for me to say the ethical witness is essential? And then number four, how would you explain the 60-year gap in defining PTSD in the DSM-4, right? Freud seems pretty clear in 1920. This is PTSD. Why does it take so long to get it as a diagnosable symptom? So what do we want to do first? Do you want to talk about the discussion questions first, or do you want to unpack some of the passages I had bolded as a way to get to the discussion questions? Any thoughts? What are you ready for? Yes, let's do it. Okay. I love this one. I think that this is where we started, right? Like for me, this is where trauma theory is born. This illustration. So I'll read it again. I told you what Carruth saw in it. I told you what I saw in it. I'm interested in what you see in it, right? So the voice of his beloved addresses him, and in this address bears witness to the past he has unwittingly repeated. Tancred's story thus represents traumatic experience not only as the enigma of a human agent's repeated unknowing acts, but also the enigma of the otherness of human voice that cries out from a wound, a voice that witnesses a truth that Tancred himself cannot fully know. I realized that I didn't put the passage itself on the slide. Do you want me to read that again? You want to go with what Carruth says? What does Carruth say about this Tancred example? What are the key words there in her reading? So does she repeat some words? Say that again. Yes. Beautiful. The voice that cries out, right? From the wound, a voice that witnesses a truth. I love that. What's the focus on the voice here? What does that tell us about her understanding of trauma? Oh, the accents. Say more about that. Unknowingly slashes on a tree, then he hears the voice of Florinda. The voice arises the trauma inside him. Beautiful. I love it. It's not like his, he murdered first time to maybe lover. She was the lover. Yes. But the voice for the first time, he hears complaining about his actions. For the past what he has done. Yes, I love that. The voice complaining about his actions. That's so important. It's not like sometimes I read this and I'm like, oh yes, that's the literal voice of Clorinda in the tree. And your response is like, no, it's not, right? Like that is not literally Clorinda. It is not a tree speaking. This is the voice in your reading. I love it, of Tancred understanding his actions repeated twice. This is a voice that is coming from within his mind, right? And reminding him of this unwitting violence, not once, but twice. So I think that's significant. And I'm, Carruth doesn't really underline that, but you're onto something. And like the idea of the address, the beloved addresses him. In this address bears witness the enigma of the otherness of the human voice, and a voice that witnesses a truth. That is 4 times mentioning this, some kind of voice bearing witness. But what would it mean to think about that voice as coming from within the soldier, right? Within Tancred himself. That's really brilliant. Other things that stand out about this one, you'll notice that Freud and Carruth say unwittingly a lot. Do you think that's interesting? Why is that emphasized? Do you want to say that? Yes. Yes. They repeat unwittingly a lot. And and I feel that the trauma dreams have a thing, like they relive it every time to think that what they could have done. Yes. What they could have done to stop it. But but they are somehow powerless to act on it. Yes. All the time. And that powerlessness and that kind of inaction is what haunts the victim more than the actual event of trauma. Yes, that's beautiful. I don't know if you could hear from the front row, but the idea is like generally when we think about trauma or regret associated with trauma, it's a failure to act. It's like freezing in the moment, not being able to do something, and that haunts you, right? Like you feel maybe guilty about that. And what this example does is kind of turn that over and talks about an unwitting action, a repeated action. So we can kind of think about that. And your lovely remark had me thinking about how an approach that's not informed by trauma would say something like, stop doing that. Like, can't you just get over it? Or like, why do you have those repeated compulsions? And the idea behind trauma studies is that it's not that easy just to stop or to go, right? That there's like something that is kind of stuck in our unconscious mind that needs to be unlocked before we can like move on. So that's really useful. The idea of action or inaction, voice. Do you want to add to that? Anyone else? I saw a hand up. I thought, oh, okay. Yes.
Also, unwillingly could refer to the lack of awareness.
Yes.
Just to know, to be aware of what we are doing and where it is coming from.
Yes.
Essential before getting to work on it.
Yes.
Unwillingly can refer to the lack of awareness also.
Yes, I love that. Unwittingly, such a key word, right? We like to think that we are in control of our bodies and minds. What would it mean for this theory to say there are times when people behave against their own best interests, against their own desires or even intentions, right? So I think that is so key. We can think about traumatic repetition in that way. It's not just doing something for the sake of doing. It is that unwitting action. It is acting against one's desires or intentions. So important. All right, so is there another passage? I think we have only 4 minutes. Do you want to look at another passage or a question? A question? Who said, yeah? So tell me, okay, I'm just going to pick one. In our breakout groups, in our when we're doing tutorials, we'll look at these passages more and these questions, but I'm wondering what you think about number one. What does it mean to think about a theoretical method grounded in not knowing? In Freud writing that whole book and saying, really what I'm trying to tell you is we will not know. We have just wandered into darkness. Welcome to the 20th century, right? What do you think about that? What's at stake? Is there a kind of use in that? Or you can also say this is radically unhelpful. Thank you. Yes, thank you. Yes, I love it. Know that you will not know everything. It's kind of comforting in that way, right? And I do think there's this kind of ethical understanding of non-mastery. You know, what does it mean to pretend you know everything, to like have control over everything? Where does that get you? Okay. Any other thoughts on that? Yes.
Assuming that we know everything draws us into a framework of closed thinking.
Great.
But when we assume that we don't know anything, we are open to more possibilities.
Yes.
And we are ready to experience different angles to approach a problem, and still we can remain grounded that we cannot know more. There are more possibilities for the future without disregarding what we already know.
Yes, that's beautiful. That's what we do as scholars, right? Like if we think less in terms of mastery and more in terms of questioning. Shoshana Fellman, who I mentioned earlier, is an advocate of keeping the question open. And she's talking to psychoanalysts, right? She's saying if you hear somebody like speaking of their traumas or histories, remember when you're interpreting, keep that question open. Have the patient keep that question open. But that is, I mean, that's a lesson for scholars, right? Keep the question open. Keep going back to the passage and finding more and more and more in it. Because once you've discovered, you think you've discovered mastery, then you stop. Then, as you say, the question is closed. We will not return to it, but that forecloses our knowledge.
It will also mean that each traumatic experience is unique and we can never draw parallels between other
Beautiful.
experiences.
I thank you so much. And that goes back to number 4. I mean, maybe there is something kind of useful about like not having something written in the DSM-4 that says if a person is experiencing these four things, then you know for sure that they are suffering from PTSD and how you treat it. Because, as you say, everyone is different. Like, everyone will experience the same event and have a different reaction to it. Some will have traumatic neurotic compulsions, and other people will walk away having not experienced that at all. So I love that idea, that every individual is different, which means every individual's reaction to experience is different, and everybody's like coming to closure, if it's possible, is different. So maybe we should end there. We had an hour, right? I don't want to take up too much of your brain space since we have a lot of hours to go. But thank you very much for engaging me with these foundational questions of trauma studies. So I'll see you back here at our next time, right?